something will have to be done which will radically lower the living standard, blah, blah. But their problem was Tito was old and dying, and they wanted, okay, the chicken not to know. They wanted Tito to die happy. So for 6-7 years, till 1980, when Tito finally died, the Yugoslavia got incredibly into debt, like some $20 billion and so on. They were, the famous phrase in Hitchcock's Psycho at the beginning, that corrupt guy who tempts Marion. He said, she told him, "Are you buying happiness?" He said, "No, I'm just, I'm not buying happiness. I'm just buying off non-happiness, whatever." Something like this they were doing. They were trying to buy off, to buy time, and they succeeded. But then when the crisis struck, it struck much stronger. So again, it was an incredible example of the chicken shouldn't know, how should I put it, no? But even at a deeper level, I think this is how our culture functions. For example, imagine a civilized family. Mother and father are struggling, fighting, and so on. But in a civilized marriage, they would say, okay, listen, we fight, but let's make a pact. Our children, our small child should not know it. And they pretend that they are still happy in the eyes of the child. Of course, the game goes on. The child usually does know it, but pretends not to know it, not to make his parents even more unhappy, and so on. But this need for, here we should supplement Lacan, subject supposed to know, the formula of transference. The fundamental figure of ideology is subject supposed not to know. We need another who remains naive, who doesn't know. And this, I think, is our problem with ecology. We know it, but the chicken doesn't know it. The problem is thus that we cannot rely on our common sense. That's my first crazy conclusion. We need to get in. The only way to properly confront ecological catastrophe is to get even more denaturalized. Only in this way can we really accept the chance that what really is ecological threat, that, my God, our whole life world, the way we know it, can disappear. Please, believe me, I will give a new twist to it. Old joke, I repeated it here at least 2 times already. Donald Rumsfeld, the known, unknowns, all that. When Donald Rumsfeld, in March 2003, explained why United States have to invade Iraq, he engaged in a little bit of philosophical debate. Here is the quote of Rumsfeld. There are known knowns. There are things we know that we know. He meant, like, I am here and I know I'm here and blah, blah. Okay, then there are known unknowns. There are things that we know we don't know. It's common what he meant. Like, I know there are cars outside this building, and I don't know how many cars are there, but I know what I don't know. Then he says, but there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we don't know we don't know. This was his justification. What if Saddam has some mega weapons that it's not simply that we don't know. Does he have weapons of mass destruction? But we even don't know what we don't know. It's a total. Okay. My old joke is that Rumsfeld, the problem of American politics is that they lack ideological reflection. Sorry, they lacked, because Rumsfeld forgot, you noticed, the 4th term, which is not known unknowns, you know what you don't know, but unknown knowns. You don't know what you know. This is called in psychoanalysis unconscious. All the prejudices and so on that determine you without you even knowing it. This is why things went wrong in Iraq and so on. But I think that our problem with ecology is that what is the real obstacle towards our taking it seriously? It's a combination of unknown knowns and unknown unknowns. On the one hand, there are things we don't even know that we know. These automatical prejudices which prevent us from taking ecological crisis seriously. And then there are unknown unknowns, in the sense of some total surprises. We don't even know how nature works. When you think you master a certain organism, there can always be a surprise, and so on and so on. And this is the true epistemological problem, maybe. If the Freudian name for the unknown knowns is unconscious, the Freudian name for the unknowns is trauma, the violent intrusion of something radically unexpected, something the subject was absolutely not ready for, something the subject cannot integrate in any way. And here I want to refer briefly to a wonderful new book by Catherine Malabou, who wrote the best book on Hegel that I know in the last 20 years, published by Princeton University Press, I think, L'avenir de Hegel, The Future of Hegel, with long, beautiful introduction by Derrida, where Derrida, basically she converted Derrida. Derrida basically concedes there that he was wrong in his dismissal of Hegel. It's a totally pro-Hegelian book, her book. Okay, her new book, published literally a month ago, it's Le Nouveau Blessé, The New Wounded. The starting point of this book is the delicate echoing between internal and external real in psychoanalysis. For Freud and Lacan, external shocks, brutal, unexpected encounters or intrusions, due their properly traumatic impact to the way they touch a pre-existing traumatic psychic reality. The idea of Freud is that when you undergo a shock, even if the shock is radical, like a bomb explodes or what, the truly traumatic impact, it's not due to this shock as such, but to the way the shock arouses, disturbs, and so on, some already trauma, pre-existing trauma deep in you. This is how Malabou rereads in a very interesting way that famous Freudian dream, Father, can't you see that I'm burning? Where the external shock, the burning of the cloth covering the dead child, this is the external shock, but this external shock, fire, arouses the internal trauma, and that's the true trauma. So even the most violent intrusions of the external real owe their traumatic effect to the resonance they find in perverse mechanism, death drive, unconscious guilt feeling, or whatever. That's the point for her of Freud. External real brutal trauma doesn't count ultimately. It can simply destroy you, but doesn't count as trauma. It must found an echo in your, what Freud calls, psychic reality, the real of your inner traumas. Today, however, that's Malabou's thesis, our socio-political reality imposes multiple versions of external intrusions, traumas, which are just that, meaningless, brutal interruptions that destroy the symbolic texture of subject's identity. First, there is the brutal external physical violence, terror attacks like September 11th, the US shock and awe bombing of Iraq, street violence, rapes, and so on, but also natural catastrophes, earthquakes, tsunamis, and so on. Then there is the so-called irrational, in the sense of meaningless, destruction of the material base of our inner reality, brain tumors, Alzheimer's, organic lesions of our brain, and so on, which can utterly change, destroy even the victim's personality. And finally, there are the destructive effects of socio-symbolic violence, social exclusion, family violence, and so on. Basically, Malabou's reproach is that Freud succumbs here to the temptation of meaning. He is not ready to accept the direct destructive efficiency of external shocks. They destroy the psyche of the victim without resonating in any inner traumatic truth. For example, it would be obviously obscene to link, say, the psychic devastation of a Muslim, Musulman, the living dead in the concentration camp, to his masochism, death drive of guilt feeling. That is her big example. It's obscene to play there these Freudian games, Muslim death drive. No, it's simply, he's the victim. He is not devastated by his unconscious anxieties. He is directly brutalized by a meaningless external shock, which can in no way be hermeneutically appropriated. For Freud, if external violence gets too strong, we simply exit the psychic domain proper. For Freud, the choice is either the shock is reintegrated into a pre-existing libidinal frame, or the shock destroys psyche and nothing is left. This is how, when Freud was engaged with violence, in his texts during World War I, his point was always to show that even when you deal with physical violence at its purest, like soldiers who were brutally wounded by a gun grenade or whatever, that in order to get from here to a psychic traumatic effect, you must go through sexuality, through their sexual traumas, masochism, whatever. It's not, the causality is not direct. So what Freud cannot envisage is that the victim, as it were, survives its own death. All different forms of traumatic encounters, independent of their specific nature, social, natural, biological, symbolic, lead to the same result. A new subject is emerging today which survived its own death. The erasure of its symbolic identity. There is no continuity between this new post-traumatic subject, for example, the victim of Alzheimer's disease or some other cerebral lesions of the brain. After the shock, literally a new subject emerges. The features of this subject are well known from descriptions: lack of emotional engagement, profound indifference, detachment, and so on and so on. It is a subject who is no longer in the world, in the Heideggerian sense of engaged existence. This subject lives death as a form of life. His life is death drive embodied, a life deprived of erotic engagement. So if the 20th century was the Freudian century, the century of libido, so that even the worst nightmares were read as sadomasochist vicissitudes of the libido, the 21st century will be the century of post-traumatic disengaged subjects whose first emblematic figure was that of the Muslim in concentration camps. The feature, again, which runs through all these figures is that the cause of the catastrophe remains libidinally meaningless, resisting any interpretation. Again, I hope I made it clear. Let's take Alzheimer's. You know that when somebody is victim of Alzheimer's, you cannot even say it's the same person, just somehow reduced. It's literally a new person. You are talking to a stranger. That's her thesis of Malabou, that psychoanalysis remains at the level of repetition. Every traumatic present serves as a trigger to resuscitate all traumas and so on. But in cases like Alzheimer's and so on, Alzheimer's, survivors of terrorist attacks, whatever, we are dealing with something different. We are dealing with a radically new subject. We have still a psyche. The subject sometimes can even talk, survived, but his entire past is erased, and he or she is emotionally blank and so on. This for her is death drive embodied. And so that it's not only death drive as destruction, but you survive your death. And this kind of blank existence for her is something that Freud, and she thinks even Lacan, was not able to think. Okay, now I'm still working on this. I will not go into it now, how I think things are a little bit more complex here, that for Lacan, a similar trauma, where you, as it were, lose what she thinks happens as an accident afterwards, external encounter. I think that for Lacan it's constitutive of subject. As subject, we are, in a way, living dead, and so on. But that's another topic.